Welcome back. In tonight's episode, we're heading to Kyoto Station, one of Japan's busiest transportation hubs. Every single day, thousands of people pass through this massive station. Commuters, tourists, business people, all coming and going at all hours. But there's something that locals know, something visitors don't always pick up on right away. After midnight, when the last trains have stopped running and the crowds have thinned out, there's one taxi you should never, ever get into. So what makes this particular taxi so dangerous? Well, that's what we're here to find out. Because what happened to a young office worker named Kenji back in 2017 is the kind of story that makes you think twice before flagging down any cab after dark in Kyoto. This isn't just an urban legend. People who work at Kyoto Station, taxi drivers themselves, and even local police officers know about this. They just don't talk about it publicly. But the stories? They're out there, whispered late at night, shared in hushed tones. And once you hear what happened, you'll understand why. So let's dive in, because tonight we're going to tell you exactly why you should never, ever take that last taxi waiting outside Kyoto Station after the trains have stopped running. Kenji worked for a mid-sized trading company in Osaka. It wasn't his dream job, but it paid the bills and kept him relatively comfortable. Most nights, he'd leave the office around 7 or 8, catch the train home, and be back in his apartment by 9. Pretty standard routine for a salaryman in Japan. But this particular Wednesday in October was different. His department was preparing for a huge client presentation, and his boss made it very clear that everyone needed to stay late to finish the materials. No exceptions. By the time Kenji finally shut down his computer and packed up his things, it was already past 1 a.m. The office was nearly empty. Just a few other exhausted co-workers shuffling toward the elevators with the same dead look in their eyes. Kenji grabbed his bag, said goodnight to no one in particular, and headed out into the cool autumn night. He pulled out his phone and checked the train schedule. Last train from Osaka to Kyoto had already left an hour ago. He cursed under his breath. That meant he'd have to take a taxi all the way back to Kyoto where he lived. It was going to cost him at least 15,000 yen, maybe more. But what choice did he have? So Kenji walked to the taxi stand outside his office building and got in. The driver was polite, older, and didn't say much. Perfect. Kenji leaned his head against the window and closed his eyes. The drive to Kyoto Station took about an hour and 15 minutes. Traffic was light at this hour, and the highway stretched out dark and empty ahead of them. Kenji drifted in and out of sleep the entire way. When the driver finally pulled up to the north side of Kyoto Station, Kenji paid, thanked him, and stepped out into the cold night air. Now here's where things get important. Kenji lived about 20 minutes away from Kyoto Station by train, but there were no trains running anymore. He could have walked. It would have taken him maybe 45 minutes on foot. But he was exhausted. His feet hurt. His back ached, and all he wanted was to collapse into his bed and sleep for the next 8 hours. So he made a decision. He'd take another taxi. Just one more. Get home faster. It made sense at the time. Kyoto Station at 2:30 a.m. is a strange place. During the day, it's chaos, tourists everywhere, announcements blaring over the speakers, people rushing to catch the Shinkansen. But at this hour, it's almost completely silent. The massive glass atrium that usually glows with light is dim. Most of the shops are closed, metal shutters pulled down tight. The few people still around are either homeless individuals trying to stay warm or the occasional traveler who missed their last connection. And then there are the taxis. On the north side of Kyoto Station, there's a designated taxi stand. During the day, there are dozens of cabs lined up, drivers waiting for passengers. But after midnight, especially after the last train stop, the number of taxis drops significantly. Most drivers don't want to hang around that late. It's not worth it. Not enough passengers, too much waiting. So by 2:30 a.m., you're lucky if there are even 2 or 3 cabs waiting. And that night, when Kenji walked over to the taxi stand, there was only one. Just one taxi. Sitting there, engine running, headlights on. Kenji didn't think anything of it at first. He was tired. He just wanted to go home. So he walked up to the cab and reached for the door handle. That's when he noticed something. The taxi looked old. Really old. It wasn't one of the newer models you usually see in Kyoto. This one looked like it was from the 1982, maybe even earlier. The paint was faded, the chrome around the windows was tarnished, and there was this smell. Even before Kenji opened the door, he could smell it. A weird, stale odor, like old cigarettes mixed with something else, something he couldn't quite place. But again, Kenji was exhausted. He pulled the door open and got in. The moment Kenji settled into the back seat, he felt it. That uncomfortable heaviness in the air. The kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room and immediately know something is wrong, but you can't quite figure out what. The interior of the taxi was dimly lit. The overhead light flickered slightly, casting strange shadows across the cracked leather seats. And that smell, God, that smell was even stronger inside. It clung to everything. The seats, the air, even Kenji's clothes seemed to absorb it within seconds. He glanced up at the rearview mirror to get a look at the driver, and that's when he saw him. An older man, maybe in his 60s or 70s, thin, gaunt even. His face was pale, almost grey, and his eyes, Kenji couldn't really see his eyes clearly. The angle of the mirror and the dim light made it hard to make out any details, but something about the way the driver sat there, completely still, hands gripping the steering wheel, unsettled him. "Where to?" the driver asked. His voice was raspy. Dry. Like he hadn't spoken in hours. Kenji cleared his throat. Kitaku, near Kinkakuji Temple. I'll give you directions as we go." The driver didn't respond. He just shifted the car into gear and pulled away from the station. No confirmation, no polite acknowledgement. Just silence. Kenji tried to brush it off. Maybe the guy was just tired. Old, antisocial, whatever. He'd be home in 20 minutes, and that would be the end of it. But as they drove through the empty streets of Kyoto, Kenji started to notice more things. Small things that, on their own, didn't mean much. But together, they painted a very unsettling picture. For one, the driver never once looked at the road signs. Kyoto is a maze of narrow streets, especially in the older residential areas. Even experienced drivers sometimes need to check signs or use GPS. But this driver? He never hesitated, never slowed down to check. It was like he knew exactly where he was going without needing any directions at all. And then there was the route. Kenji knew Kyoto fairly well. He'd lived there for 3 years. And the route the driver was taking? It wasn't the main route. It wasn't even a shortcut. The driver was taking back roads, side streets, alleyways that Kenji didn't even know existed. At one point, they turned down a street so narrow that Kenji was convinced the taxi wouldn't fit. But somehow, it did. The buildings on either side were so close that Kenji could have reached out and touched them if the window was open. "Excuse me," Kenji said, leaning forward slightly. "Are you sure this is the right way? I've never been down this street before." The driver didn't respond. Not a word. Not even a glance in the rearview mirror. He just kept driving. Hands on the wheel. Eyes forward. Silent. Kenji felt his heart start to beat a little faster. Okay, this is weird. This is definitely weird. He pulled out his phone, thinking he'd check Google Maps to see where they were. But when he looked at the screen, his stomach dropped. No signal, not even one bar. That shouldn't be possible. They were still in Kyoto, still in the city. How could there be no signal? He tried refreshing, turning his phone off and on. Nothing. And then, just as he was starting to panic, the driver spoke again. "You work late." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Kenji froze. How would he know that? He hadn't mentioned anything about work. He'd only given his destination. Nothing else. Yeah, Kenji said cautiously. "I had to stay late at the office tonight." "Every Wednesday," the driver continued, still not looking back. "You always work late on Wednesdays." Kenji's blood ran cold. What the hell? How could this driver possibly know that? He'd never taken this cab before. He'd never even seen this taxi in his life. And yet, this man was talking like he knew Kenji's schedule, like he'd been watching him. "How do you know that?" Kenji asked, his voice shaking now. The driver didn't answer. Kenji's hands were trembling now. He stared at the back of the driver's head, waiting for an explanation, but none came. The silence in the cab was suffocating. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the old suspension as they rolled over uneven pavement. Outside, the streets were completely deserted. No cars, no pedestrians. Not even a stray cat. Just darkness and the occasional flicker of a streetlight. Kenji tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the driver had picked him up before and Kenji just didn't remember. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He would have remembered this cab. He would have remembered that smell, that face. Everything about this situation screamed wrong. And then the driver spoke again. "You should have walked tonight." Kenji's breath caught in his throat. What? What did you say? "You should have walked." the driver repeated, his voice flat and emotionless. Like you did last Wednesday, and the Wednesday before that. But tonight, you were too tired, so you took the taxi. Panic surged through Kenji's chest. This man had been watching him. For weeks, maybe longer. He knew Kenji's routine, knew when he worked late, knew that he usually walked home from the station. And now, Kenji was trapped in this cab with him, speeding through dark, unfamiliar streets with no way to call for help. Stop the car, Kenji said, trying to keep his voice steady. I want to get out, right now. The driver didn't respond. He didn't even slow down. If anything, the car seemed to be going faster now. The narrow streets blurred past the windows, and Kenji realized with growing horror that he had no idea where they were anymore. Nothing looked familiar. Not the buildings, not the signs. It was like they'd driven into a completely different part of the city. Or maybe they weren't in the city at all anymore. Kenji reached for the door handle and pulled. It didn't budge. He pulled again, harder this time. Still nothing. The door was locked. Child-locked, maybe. Or something else entirely. He twisted around, trying the other door. Same thing. Locked. Let me out, Kenji shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Open the door. Let me out right now. For the first time since they'd started driving, the driver looked at him through the rearview mirror. And when Kenji saw his eyes, he felt every muscle in his body freeze. Those eyes, they weren't human. They were empty, hollow, like looking into two black pits that led nowhere. There was no life in them, no emotion, just nothing. You shouldn't have gotten in, the driver said quietly. And then everything went dark. When Kenji opened his eyes, he was lying on cold pavement. His head throbbed, his mouth was dry, and for a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or what had happened. He sat up slowly, his vision swimming, and looked around. He was at Kyoto Station, on the north side, right where he'd gotten into the taxi. He checked his phone. 4:47 a.m. More than 2 hours had passed. 2 hours that Kenji had no memory of. He stood up, his legs shaky, and looked around the taxi stand. It was empty. No cabs. No people. Just the faint glow of the station lights and the sound of the first morning trains beginning to rumble to life inside. Kenji stumbled toward the station entrance, his heart still racing. What the hell just happened? Was it real? Had he really been in that taxi? Or had he somehow passed out here on the sidewalk and dreamed the whole thing? But no, he could still smell it. That awful stale smell that had clung to everything inside the cab. It was on his clothes, in his hair. It was real. The next morning, Kenji went to the police. He filed a report, gave them every detail he could remember, the old taxi, the driver's face, the route they'd taken, everything. The officer who took his statement listened patiently, typing everything into the computer, but when Kenji finished, the officer paused, exchanged a glance with his colleague, and said something that made Kenji's blood run cold. Sir, you're not the first person to report this. We've had similar complaints, always late at night, always from Kyoto Station, always the same description of the taxi and the driver. Kenji stared at him. What do you mean? Has anyone else gone missing? The officer hesitated. No one's gone missing, but everyone who's reported it says the same thing. They lose time, wake up back at the station with no memory of what happened. Some people have described injuries, bruises, scratches, but nothing serious enough to open a formal investigation. So what are you saying? Kenji asked, his voice rising. That this is just happening and no one's doing anything about it? The officer looked uncomfortable. Look, sir, we've tried to track down the taxi. We've checked the security cameras at the station, but we can never find it. The footage always shows you standing at the taxi stand alone. No taxi, no driver, just you. And then the cameras glitch for a few hours, and when they come back on, you're lying on the ground. Kenji felt sick. The officer leaned forward. My advice? Don't take taxis from Kyoto Station after midnight, especially if there's only one waiting. Just don't. Walk. Take a hotel. Call a friend. Anything. But don't get into that cab. Kenji never took a taxi from Kyoto Station again. Not after that night. And to this day, locals will tell you the same thing. If you're ever at Kyoto Station late at night and you see a taxi sitting there all alone, engine running, headlights on, keep walking, because that last taxi, it's not taking you home. And if you get in, you might not remember where it takes you at all. Or worse, you might never come back.